You can't heal until you feel this rage. Vertical bar, Carl Jung's warning. You've been told your anger makes you unspiritual, that to be kind means to be quiet. But what if your rage isn't a sin? What if it's sacred? Carl Jung believed that buried within every empath's suffering lies a divine fire, the power to reclaim your truth, your boundaries, and your soul. This is not a story about losing control. It's about remembering the fire you've been taught to fear and realizing it was never meant to destroy you but to set you free. Part 1. The hidden shadow of the empath. When compassion becomes self-destruction. Empaths often see themselves as healers, as people destined to feel deeply for others. But in Jungian terms, this identity is rarely complete. It is a persona, a socially accepted mask that hides an unacknowledged opposite inside the psyche. The empath's light, their endless compassion, their quiet understanding often conceals a profound fear of rejection and guilt. They carry the archetype of the good soul, yet behind that brightness lies a shadow filled with suppressed rage, unmet needs, and buried boundaries. Jung would say that the empath's suffering begins the moment their persona is mistaken for their self. When an empath enters the world, they quickly learn that their sensitivity earns praise when it serves others. They become the listener, the rescuer, the emotional container for other people's pain. Over time, this conditioning shapes their complexes, autonomous psychic patterns that make them feel responsible for others' emotions. The empath begins to equate love with self-sacrifice. Their inner child concludes, if I absorb the pain, maybe no one will leave. In Jungian analysis, this dynamic mirrors the mother complex, the instinct to nurture even when it means bleeding quietly in the dark. But repression has a cost. Each time the empath swallows their frustration, tells themselves it's okay or forgives, before they've truly healed, they push psychic energy into the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the rejected part of the personality that the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. For the empath, this shadow often contains anger, resentment, and the desire to assert control. Yet because these emotions conflict with their persona of kindness, they disown them. They say, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, or I don't need an apology, I understand. Every denial strengthens the split between the ego and the unconscious, creating a pressure that eventually seeks release. This pressure manifests as exhaustion, anxiety, or physical symptoms. The empath begins to experience emotional fatigue without knowing why. They feel drained after social interactions, yet still blame themselves for not being loving enough. Jung would interpret this as a neurosis born from imbalance, a symptom that signals the psyche's attempt to restore wholeness. The body becomes the battlefield between the conscious ideal of peace and the unconscious demand for truth. The empath's kindness, once sacred, now turns against them as a form of quiet self-destruction. What makes this shadow so complex is its moral disguise. Empaths rarely admit they're angry because anger contradicts their spiritual or moral identity. But Jung reminded us that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. To grow spiritually, the empath must descend into their own emotional underworld. The rage they fear is not demonic. It is the libido, the raw life energy seeking balance. By denying it, they deny their vitality. Relationships often become the mirror that exposes this split. The empath unconsciously attracts those who embody their disowned traits, the narcissist, the manipulator, the emotionally unavailable. These figures are projections of the shadow, acting out the aggression and self-assertion the empath refuses to express. The empath becomes the martyr, the other, the taker. Jung would say both are possessed by opposite poles of the same archetype, the wounded healer versus the devouring shadow. Together they create a psychological alchemy meant to force the empath into awareness. Every betrayal or disappointment whispers the same lesson. Look at your own fire. When the empath finally feels that something inside them is breaking, it is often the persona collapsing. Their old identity, the nice one, the fixer, the patient one, no longer fits. This collapse can feel like death because the ego resists integration. But Jung viewed this crisis as sacred. It is the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole by reconciling opposites. The empath's sacred rage starts to stir at this point, not as blind fury, but as the first pulse of life from the unconscious demanding to be heard. To understand the sacred rage, we must first understand what it protects. Beneath the empath's gentleness lies a deep instinct for justice and authenticity. Their anger emerges when love has been corrupted into obligation. It is not cruelty that awakens the fire, but betrayal of the soul's truth. In this sense, the empath's rage is not destructive. It is a moral force, a call for integrity. Jung saw this as the moment when the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, begins to challenge the ego's false identity. The self says you are more than your kindness, you are wholeness, and wholeness includes the dark. As the empath starts to observe their anger rather than repress it, they notice it speaks in symbols. Nightmares of firestorms or broken mirrors often appear. Jung would interpret these as images of transformation fire, as purification storms, as release mirrors, as confrontation with truth. The psyche uses symbolic language to express what words cannot. The empath's unconscious communicates through emotional intensity because logic has long been ignored. Their tears are not weakness, they are messages from the depths. This stage is emotionally volatile. The empath may swing between guilt for feeling angry and liberation for finally acknowledging it. They may distance themselves from people who drain them, experiencing both relief and loneliness. This tension is necessary. Jung warned that individuation is never comfortable. It requires enduring the conflict between opposites until a new synthesis emerges. The empath's sacred rage is the crucible in which false identities burn away, revealing a more authentic self beneath. The transition from compassion to self-destruction happens when love is divorced from truth. The empath's journey back to balance begins when they recognize that true compassion includes boundaries, that saying no is not rejection, but self-respect. In Jungian therapy, this often involves active imagination, dialoguing with the inner figures that represent both the nurturing and the enraged parts. Through this, the empath learns to integrate the energy of anger as a guardian rather than an enemy. The hidden shadow of the empath, once feared, now becomes the source of their strength. They start to understand that rage is not the opposite of love, but its fierce defender. Without it, love becomes servitude. Jung would say the empath has touched the realm of archetypal power, the point where personal emotion meets universal principle. The sacred rage is not about destruction. It is about restoring the natural order within the psyche. When compassion turns into self-destruction, the unconscious sends fire as a warning. The empath's sacred task is not to extinguish it, but to let it illuminate the places where they've betrayed themselves. In doing so, they transform pain into wisdom and sensitivity into sovereignty. This is the beginning of their descent, the necessary first step into the alchemical fire of transformation that will be explored in the next part. Part 2, the sacred rage, when repression turns into fire. For the empath, anger is rarely expressed directly. It builds like quiet static behind the ribs, years of swallowed words, silent forgiveness, and unspoken resentment. Jung believed that what is not made conscious will surface as fate, meaning that the emotions we repress eventually manifest as outer circumstances that force us to confront them. In the empath's life, this fate often arrives as betrayal, exhaustion, or a deep spiritual crisis. The very sensitivity that once made them gentle becomes the spark that ignites their sacred fire. From a Jungian perspective, repression is not merely forgetting, it is an energetic act of pushing psychic material into the unconscious. Each time the empath suppresses anger, that energy doesn't disappear. It is stored like heat beneath the surface. The psyche, seeking balance, begins to compensate. The more the conscious ego insists on being peaceful and kind, the more the unconscious brews its opposite. This is the law of psychic polarity. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Jung saw anger as a signal from the self that the psyche's equilibrium has been violated. Sacred rage, then, is not rage against others, but against falseness, against the lie of being endlessly self-sacrificing, the delusion that peace must come at the cost of authenticity. When the empath finally allows this anger to rise, it feels dangerous, almost blasphemous. But beneath that fear lies liberation. It is the fire of the unconscious, attempting to burn away what no longer serves individuation. This sacred fire carries the archetype of the warrior. Unlike the ego's destructive aggression, the archetypal warrior energy protects life. It demands truth, integrity, and boundaries. In myth, this energy appears as Archangel Michael with a flaming sword, or the hero who slays the dragon not out of hate but to restore balance. In the empath's psyche, sacred rage is this inner warrior awakening after years of silence. The empath's tears dry, their trembling voice steadies. They begin to say words that once terrified them. No, stop, that's not acceptable. To Jung, this moment marks a profound turning point. The repressed energy has transformed into conscious fire, and with it comes empowerment. But empowerment does not emerge instantly. It requires discernment. The empath must learn to differentiate between reactive anger, which belongs to the ego's wounds, and sacred rage, which belongs to the self's moral center. Reactive anger seeks revenge. Sacred rage seeks restoration. One destroys, the other purifies. In therapy, Jung often encouraged confronting these emotions through active imagination, allowing the inner voice of rage to speak without censorship. When an empath listens to their inner fire instead of fearing it, they discover it speaks in truth, not hatred. It says, "You matter, your boundaries are sacred, your silence has cost too much." This dialogue transforms rage from an enemy into an ally, a messenger of lost self-worth demanding to be reclaimed. There is an alchemical symbolism to this process. Jung compared psychic transformation to the work of alchemy, the heating of base matter until impurities burn away. Sacred rage is that heat. It is not pleasant. It consumes illusions, attachments, and self-deceptions. But through the fire, the empath's ego becomes more refined, more transparent to the self. The process is painful precisely because it dissolves an old identity, the one built on compliance, niceness, and martyrdom. At this stage, relationships often shift dramatically. The empath, who once tolerated manipulation, now feels repulsed by it. They sense lies, energetic violations, or guilt tactics with surgical clarity. This heightened awareness is not arrogance, it's the psyche reclaiming its natural defenses. Jung would describe this as the integration of the shadow function of the feeling type, the capacity to say this feels wrong without apology. The empath learns that compassion without discernment is codependency, not love. Sacred rage is a form of moral intelligence. It arises when the soul witnesses injustice, both external and internal. When the empath's spirit realizes they have been complicit in their own diminishment, that realization burns like lightning through the nervous system. Yet this fire also signals rebirth. In mythology, this is the stage where the hero enters the furnace, the dark night of purification. To the unconscious, fire is the image of transformation. It destroys the old structure to create space for a new psychic order. From a depth psychological standpoint, the empath's sacred rage represents the eruption of archetypal energy, the self reclaiming dominion over a fragmented personality. The ego, once enslaved by the persona of the good person, is now confronted with the raw, uncontrollable force of the unconscious. Jung warned that this moment can feel like possession, but if faced consciously, it becomes initiation. The empath moves from victimhood to sovereignty. The fire also exposes false spirituality. Many empaths mistake repression for enlightenment, believing that love and light means never confronting darkness. Jung saw this as spiritual inflation, where the ego identifies with the light and denies its shadow. True spirituality, he insisted, is integration, embracing both Christ and the serpent light and dark mercy and wrath. Sacred rage reveals that love without truth is sentimental illusion. As the empath confronts this fire, old emotions resurface: childhood wounds, humiliation, betrayals. These are the ashes of the past that must be acknowledged, not analyzed away. Jung said that only what is accepted can be transformed. The empath learns to sit with the heat, neither suppressing nor exploding. They breathe through it, realizing the fire does not wish to harm them, it wishes to free them. Eventually, sacred rage refines itself into clarity. The empath no longer needs to shout or prove their worth. They stand in quiet authority, their presence commanding respect. This is the beginning of self-possession, when the individual becomes the vessel of their own energy rather than leaking it to others. The empath's nervous system, once hyper-attuned to others' pain, now stabilizes in the grounded rhythm of authenticity. In Jungian terms, this is the awakening of the self as inner fire, the point where instinct and spirit unite. The empath who once feared confrontation now understands that conflict is sometimes divine. It is the way the soul asserts boundaries so that love can exist in truth. The sacred rage is no longer a storm, it becomes light. By turning toward the fire instead of away from it, the empath honors the paradox at the heart of individuation, that healing often feels like destruction and love often begins with saying no. The repressed emotion has become sacred because it no longer serves the ego's wounds but the self's wholeness. This is the alchemy. Jung described the transformation of lead into gold, or in psychological terms of repression into empowerment. The empath who embraces sacred rage discovers their inner flame was never meant to burn others, it was meant to illuminate their path out of servitude. In the next part, this flame evolves further. It becomes the force that guides the empath toward individuation, where compassion and power finally merge into one balanced whole. Part 3. Individuation, integrating light and shadow. When the empath finally stops fearing their fire, the process of individuation begins. In Jungian depth psychology, individuation is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming whole. It is the lifelong task of integrating the opposites within the psyche, light and dark, love and rage, compassion and power, so that they no longer fight each other but work together in harmony. For the empath, this stage is the psychological rebirth that follows years of fragmentation. At the start of this transformation, the empath may feel torn between two inner voices. One whispers, "Stay kind, forgive, be patient," while the other roars, "Enough, you've betrayed yourself for too long." Jung would say this tension is the opus contra naturam, the work against one's habitual nature. It feels unnatural because the ego has long identified with one pole, kindness, peace, submission, and demonized the other, anger, self-assertion, rebellion. Integration means allowing both to coexist without judgment. The empath must accept that love without strength is weakness, and strength without love is brutality. This reconciliation often begins in solitude. When the empath withdraws from the noise of emotional caretaking, they enter what Jung called the interior dialogue, a confrontation with the unconscious. Memories resurface, voices of past conditioning echo. Be nice. Don't upset anyone. You're too sensitive. But beneath these inherited messages lies the authentic self waiting patiently like an ancient flame. The empath begins to realize that their sensitivity was never meant to be servitude, it was meant to be vision, intuition, and connection to the divine. Their rage too is not corruption but sacred energy reclaiming its right to exist. In this stage, dreams become vivid. Fire appears often not destructive flames but glowing embers, torches, and phoenixes. Jung saw dreams as messages from the unconscious, compensating for the imbalance of consciousness. When the empath dreams of fire that doesn't burn, it symbolizes transformation energy once suppressed, now purified and integrated. The psyche is saying, "Your rage has matured. It is now light." Through this process, the empath begins to embody the archetype of the alchemist. They no longer run from their emotions, but transmute them. Sadness becomes depth, anger becomes discernment, solitude becomes strength. In alchemical terms, this is the rubedo phase, the reddening when the soul achieves unity after chaos. It's the moment the empath realizes that every tear, every boundary crossed, was a necessary ingredient in the gold of self-awareness. Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, the divine center guiding individuation. As the empath confronts their shadow, the self begins to reorganize their inner world. They start recognizing projections. Where they once saw villains and victims, they now see mirrors. The narcissist who once manipulated them becomes the symbol of their own disowned authority. The cold, distant friend becomes the reflection of their own unmet need for autonomy. Each encounter that once wounded them now teaches them about their inner landscape. This awareness brings tremendous peace, but also responsibility. The empath can no longer hide behind blame or martyrdom. Jung would say they are now conscious participants in their own myth. They understand that their relationships were not punishments but invitations to integrate lost parts of themselves. Sacred rage was not meant to destroy others, it was meant to awaken their integrity. The most striking sign of individuation is the emergence of boundaries without bitterness. The empath no longer says yes to be loved or no to prove strength. Their choices flow naturally from self-knowledge. They no longer rescue everyone because they understand that pain too has purpose. They stop explaining their worth because they finally feel it. Jung would call this the union of the opposites, the creation of a new psychic attitude that transcends duality. In this balanced state, love becomes fierce yet kind. The empath forgives without erasing accountability. They can comfort others without absorbing their pain. This is emotional sovereignty, the soul's maturity. Jung believed that true morality arises not from obeying rules, but from listening to the inner voice of the self. For the empath, that voice says, "Protect your light, but let it shine through truth." Symbolically, this transformation mirrors the myth of the phoenix, the bird that dies in flames and rises renewed from its ashes. The empath's sacred rage was the fire that consumed the false self. Individuation is the flight that follows. Now every spark of anger, every pulse of intuition serves a higher order of consciousness. The empath becomes both the flame and the light. Yet Jung warned that individuation is not a one-time event but a rhythm, a lifelong dance between awareness and unconsciousness. The empath will still meet moments of doubt and fatigue, but they now know how to navigate them. They understand that darkness is not regression, it's integration in progress. Each emotional storm is another opportunity to realign with the self. At this point, the empath embodies what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without fragmentation. They no longer divide emotions into good or bad, divine or demonic. Instead, they perceive their inner life as a living ecosystem. Rage guards compassion, sorrow deepens joy, solitude enhances connection. The empath has become their own healer. Individuation grants the empath a new kind of authority, the authority of authenticity. They no longer need external validation because they are in communion with something eternal within. Jung described this as the mandala of the self, a symbolic wholeness where every part finds its rightful place. For the empath, it feels like finally coming home to their own soul. The once fractured identity of the too kind and too sensitive person dissolves. What remains is an integrated being, soft yet unbreakable, compassionate yet discerning. Sacred rage now lives quietly in their chest, not as fire to burn others, but as a hearth to warm themselves and those who meet them in truth. This is the holy paradox of the awakened empath, to be both gentle and fierce, yielding and immovable. Jung would call it the union of logos and eros, the masculine principle of clarity, united with the feminine principle of empathy. Through this marriage, the empath becomes psychologically and spiritually androgynous, a complete being. The sacred rage, once feared and suppressed, becomes the guardian of the soul's integrity. It ensures that compassion never again devolves into self-betrayal. The empath, once bound by guilt, now moves through the world with quiet fire, aware that to love truthfully is to embrace both light and shadow. In this way, individuation does not erase the empath's sensitivity, it refines it. It transforms emotional reactivity into conscious response dependence. into inner alignment, and woundedness into wisdom. The empath no longer serves as a mirror for others, but as a lighthouse shining steadily, illuminating both the beauty and the darkness that coexist within the human heart. And so the sacred rage that once frightened them becomes the symbol of their rebirth. It is no longer the flame of destruction, it is the eternal light of consciousness itself. Part 4. The fire of transformation, living as an empowered empath. Once the empath integrates both light and shadow, their sacred rage no longer consumes them, it guides them. What was once chaos becomes clarity. What once felt like punishment now becomes power. Jung called this stage transformation through consciousness, where the ego no longer fights the unconscious but cooperates with it. The empath emerges from this inner fire not as a victim of their sensitivity but as its master. The empowered empath lives with a quiet authority. Their compassion is no longer born from fear of abandonment, but from the wholeness of knowing who they are. They have faced their inner darkness and survived its heat. This survival grants them what Jung described as psychological resilience, the ability to hold pain without being defined by it. Their sacred rage becomes a compass pointing toward authenticity. When something violates their peace, they don't suppress it or explode. They listen. They ask, what truth is this discomfort trying to reveal? This state of consciousness marks the empath's entry into the realm of self-leadership. In Jungian terms, this is when the ego aligns itself with the self, the divine center of the psyche. The empath no longer lives reactively shaped by others' emotions, but proactively guided by inner knowing. Their boundaries are not walls of defense, but expressions of self-respect. They no longer drain themselves to prove their goodness, because their worth is no longer conditional. In this phase, the empath discovers that the sacred fire within them is creative energy, libido in Jung's sense of the word. It is life force, the power that animates growth, art, and spiritual vision. What used to burn in anger now fuels purpose. Many empaths find themselves drawn to new forms of creation, writing, healing, teaching, music, or service, grounded in authenticity rather than martyrdom. Their rage, once destructive, becomes transmuted into eros, the passionate drive to connect life with meaning. Jung taught that when the opposites unite, the psyche births a new consciousness, a synthesis that transcends duality. For the empath, this synthesis manifests as emotional intelligence rooted in self-trust. They can witness cruelty without absorbing it, love without losing themselves, forgive without erasing boundaries. They embody what Jung called the self-regulating system of the psyche, where energy flows freely between shadow and light. This integration profoundly changes their relationships. The empath no longer attracts those who feed on their energy, because they no longer vibrate from lack. Their aura feels different, strong, balanced, radiant. They become magnetic not through emotional availability but through authenticity. People sense their depth but also their firmness. Their presence carries both peace and power. Jung would describe this as the emergence of the individuated personality, someone whose inner alignment naturally influences their surroundings. The empowered empath's sacred rage now serves a higher moral function. It arises when truth is threatened, not when ego is offended. This is what Jung called numinous anger, an emotion that carries spiritual authority. It defends what is sacred: integrity, justice, and love grounded in reality. The empath learns to channel this energy consciously, using it to speak truth, protect innocence, and inspire courage in others. They become embodiments of what Jung termed the wounded healer, individuals who have transformed their pain into wisdom and can now guide others through their own inner fires. Still, this new state is not the end of the journey. Jung emphasized that individuation is cyclical. Each new level of awareness invites deeper challenges. The empath will continue to meet situations that test their balance, but they face them differently now, with presence instead of panic, with understanding instead of guilt. The sacred fire no longer terrifies them because they have become its keeper. In spiritual terms, this stage mirrors the archetype of the alchemical gold matter transmuted into its highest form. Psychologically, it's the empath reclaiming sovereignty over their energy. They stop chasing love because they are love in motion. They no longer need to fix others because they now trust the process of their own unfolding. The world around them begins to shift. Opportunities, connections, and synchronicities appear as reflections of their inner alignment. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that mirrors the harmony between inner and outer reality. The empath who once feared conflict now understands that life's fire is sacred. Conflict reveals truth. Endings birth beginnings. Rage protects love. They no longer suppress emotion but let it flow through awareness. This flow is their true power. They have transformed suffering into wisdom, sensitivity, into intuition, boundaries, into freedom. The sacred rage now lives as a steady flame within their soul, a reminder that compassion without truth is illusion and truth without compassion is cruelty. Holding both, they embody wholeness. Jung believed that this is the highest form of consciousness, to live from the self, where opposites coexist without annihilating each other. In this final stage, the empath becomes a luminous paradox, soft yet unyielding, kind yet fierce, peaceful yet fiery. They have learned that enlightenment is not the absence of emotion but the mastery of it. Their sacred rage is now the guardian of their light, ensuring that empathy never again becomes self-erasure. The fire that once burned them now fuels them. The empath walks through life with the grace of someone who has seen the abyss and chosen to rise anyway. Their eyes no longer seek validation, they radiate awareness. They have become what Jung called a living symbol of transformation, proof that wholeness is not found in denying darkness, but in embracing it fully. The sacred rage of the empath, once hidden and feared, is the very flame through which their soul becomes divine. It is not a curse, but a calling, a fire meant not to destroy the world, but to illuminate it. The empath's rage was never evil. It was the soul's final attempt to awaken. When you embrace your fire, you no longer burn out, you become the light itself. Jung would call this the highest stage of transformation, when the shadow and the light finally walk hand in hand. So if you're feeling that sacred rage rising, don't silence it. Honor it. Because that's not anger, it's your soul remembering who you are.